Hey, thanks for tuning in. So I thought it would be helpful for a lot of artists out there to get this overview of how I go about coloring artwork in this sort of comic book style. The inking, the coloring, essentially my process step by step. And what I do to start is essentially I work with the Armature 9 biped that I also make available on armature9.com. And I like iterating on poses with this figure because it can get in any pose humanly possible. And it's the only artist mannequin out there that actually can do this. So there's the pose at the very end that I ended up going with. And what I do is I bring that photograph into Photoshop. Often I also just draw by looking at it. I just have it standing next to my desk and I draw from life essentially. But for the sake of this video, it's best to work from a photograph. So there's the image. And what I do is I try to derive from it all the essential perspective lines and the proportion of the figure in perspective and in this pose. Because I really want to get rid of the reference as quickly as possible so that I'm looking at a drawing. And so there's the drawing. And now that I can assess it as a drawing, I can think about it in terms of composition. I can think about how it works aesthetically, visually, and make whatever edits I need to it. I don't really want to be a slave to my reference, but it's a great departure point because it solves all my challenges with perspective and foreshortening, and I can just then focus on design and drawing and not have to stress about all those technical problems that you might run into otherwise. So essentially at this point I'm just fleshing out the drawing and making whatever edits I feel are most appropriate to convey the right emotion, the right sense of movement, make whatever changes are necessary so that the composition works, so that this works as a visual piece now. And so here I'm skipping ahead to the environment and I'm using Tiny Town tiles, which is another product I make available as well. And the way I like working with these is I record video of me rotating them and spinning them around in front of the camera, and that way I can play back the video and scrub through it and have infinite angles to pick from. And I pick an angle and I try to derive some perspective from it, and if I don't like it I move on to another one. I try a different angle, I take a screenshot of the video, paste it into Photoshop, and here I've come up with one that I think is going to work well. And so I can play around with the position of it, the rotation, and try to pick something that works well with the composition. I've got an angle there that's going to frame the foot nicely. And I do the same thing I did with the photograph of the armature, essentially try to derive my perspective lines from it so that I don't have to be a slave to the reference. I want to get rid of the reference as quickly as possible, but it saves me a whole bunch of time because I'm able to derive this three-dimensional grid that I can then use to improvise my own building shapes and designs from. So now I'm approaching sort of a finished sketch for the piece. I'm going to do some work on the clouds here in a minute, but essentially this shows you how quickly you can go about constructing a composition using these tools as reference. Now this for some people might be a backwards approach to work because I know myself, I've also worked the other way, which is to create thumbnails and take a more traditional design process where you iterate on value studies and compositional studies and then refine from there. But in this case, we're starting at sort of a high detail level and working our way back, which is completely valid. It's just another way of working. And as I flesh out this YouTube channel with more tutorials, you'll see that I'm going to use both approaches. So I'm going to go back and forward between both. And I'm going to show a couple different techniques and different painting styles, some that use this sort of ink and color approach and others that use more of a painterly approach. So as I continue to flesh out the drawing, one of the things that I really want to pay attention to are the positive and negative spaces. Composition is king in any illustration. And so here you can see me start to clean up the line work, but I'm doing it from the point of view of positive and negative spaces. So I'm trying to focus on that, make sure that the lines, the outlines of the shapes talk to each other. And what I mean by that is essentially think of the curves and the angles and the spaces that exist between them like you would think about the letters of a font. You want them to feel like they're kind of drawn in the same language, right? So that there's a overall visual unity to the piece. And then of course there's positive and negative spaces within the positive and negative spaces, and that's where the details come in, like the buildings. But I am noticing at this point that there are some tangent issues, some areas where lines are intersecting with other lines in awkward ways, and I'll highlight that in a minute. I'm working in Photoshop. This is Photoshop CS2 actually, it's a very old version. So I'm just using a basic brush and a layer on top of another layer that had my sketch to do the cleanup sketch. So here I'm trying to highlight what I was talking about earlier regarding positive and negative shapes. I'm taking a shape that is there between the forearm and the smoke behind the character's head, filling it in, and as I rotate this around and move it around, you'll notice that the profiles and the shapes of this puzzle piece, is one way to look at it, resemble a lot of the other shapes and other parts of the composition. Now, you could almost move it around and find places to fit it into. And so this is a good thing. You want those curves and those lines to essentially share the same visual language. Now here in red, I'm trying to highlight the tangency problems that I currently have in the composition, where some lines from one object come too closely to the lines of a completely different object, causing a sort of visual ambiguity where you can't tell where something begins and ends because they intersect so closely with an object that is completely separate from it. And so I'm going to address those issues as I move forward. My plan with the cityscape is to go with a very simplified palette, so I think that in and of itself is going to help solve a lot of the problems. But now essentially I'm cleaning up the drawing further with an ink layer and just carefully drawing what could potentially be final line work. It isn't in this case, because I know that after this I went over it maybe 2 or 3 more times. Because as you polish and clean up the drawing, you realize there are some other areas that you really needed to do more research on before you started doing the cleanup. Specifically in my composition, I noticed that these boots were so front and center that they really warranted some more researched design. And so I did iterate on those quite a bit, and you'll see them change just dramatically here as I skip forward. And I essentially do this for the entire composition. There you can see me skipping ahead to a more defined version. But even then, I would tone that down, and on a separate layer, I would draw it over again. But this time, really try to streamline my lines so that the curves are more simplified and they don't have a lot of noise to them. So try to keep things as slick and simple as possible, but still stay true to the shapes that I've defined. Line width, of course, is something else that's very important. And I'm trying to keep the width of the line as consistent as I can, although I do introduce some variation later on to try to make the legs feel a little closer to the camera by making them a little thicker. But as you can imagine, this is a very iterative process because these lines are very high contrast design elements, and you want to make sure that every single line counts, that every line works, that it communicates well visually, that it interacts well with neighboring lines, that the lines feel like they belong to the shape they're supposed to belong to and not to another shape. And so I find myself often just either erasing and redrawing or adding another layer over the top and just drawing it all over again and giving it another shot. Sometimes it's a matter of just kind of zooming in a little more every time so that you're getting higher fidelity with the quality of the line when you're working digitally. But sometimes it's just a matter of iterating until you get it right. In this case, I'm working on a Cintiq, so I'm working directly on the screen, which helps a lot. Now, what I could have done, and I've done this in the past, I will print out the rough sketch and I will do the inking by hand. In fact, I'm doing that now for a children's book that I'm working on, and then I scan the physically inked lines and do the digital coloring underneath of those lines. And the reason I'm doing it is because it has this really nice playful texture that works well for this particular book. But for this video, I'm using Photoshop CS2. It's a fairly old version of Photoshop, and you can get it for free on Adobe's website. But as you can see, this can be a fairly time-consuming part of the process, and these videos are sped up 200% and sometimes 300%, the original speed. And I'm also skipping through them. Here I'm doing the inking for the cloud in the back, the smoke in the back, in a separate color, just to highlight the fact that I'm working on a separate layer. So when I do my inking and I do my coloring, I break up the layers based on the object. So I'll have a inking layer for the character, and I'll have an inking layer for the smoke behind his back. I'll have an inking layer for the clouds. I'll have an inking layer for the cityscape, maybe a few different layers for the cityscape. Now, some people break it up even further, like in the case of the character, they might have a layer for the straps, a layer for the leather underneath it, a layer for the gloves, etc. I don't break it up that much. I used to, but I don't anymore because it's so easy to break things up by color within one layer and then use your magic wand tool to select those colors that there's really no benefit to breaking it up into even more layers. You get sort of a diminishing returns phenomena with breaking up too many layers, because the more layers you have, the harder it is slower it is to work, because you have to go through and sort through all these layers and find the right layer to work on. In fact, what I do here toward the end of this video is I flatten the entire thing and I work on it as a painting. So here I've reached a point where I can critically assess even further my composition and start to look at what are some tangencies that I really want to address. So now I'm kind of refining my composition at a smaller scale and thinking about the details. With the building, I'm going with a limited color palette. In fact, I think I break up the entire foreground of the city in just two colors. One color for the sides of the building and another color for the building tops. And by going with the simplified approach for the city, I solve a couple of problems. One is a lot of the tangencies that are occurring between the buildings, and it also simplifies it to the point where it just gets pushed further into the background and it doesn't compete with the primary element I want you to focus on, which is the character. You can already see that if I hadn't simplified the palette for the city, I would have had so many small, tiny little positive and negative spaces between the buildings that it would have felt like it was part of a different image entirely. It's no longer stylistically consistent with the simplicity of the rest of the image. But you'll see how this kind of resolves itself on its own once I color it all in. So now I'm essentially blocking in the color layers. I started with the city, but I'm going to move on to the character here in a bit. And the dark layer for the city is one layer. The lighter gray is another layer. And I'm not really paying too much attention to color at this point. I'm just focusing on tone and value. And primarily, I just want to block in my layers too, because by having all of these separate shades, which will eventually be colors, broken up into clean layers, I can then manipulate their colors individually and essentially play with the layers until I get to a result that I like. So it's similar to, it's almost like a sculptural approach to drawing, in that you block it all in and then you work with it like a malleable piece of clay, and you just kind of iterate until you arrive at what you're after. So here I'm doing what I was doing with the buildings, but now on the character, and I'm on a completely separate layer. I'm just blocking in solid color for the entire figure. And of course you want to take your time with this, because you want to stay right behind those inked lines so that you don't go, you don't leave white little spaces between, or you don't go beyond the line. Comic book art tends to have a very clean execution. There's very little room for the imagination. There's comic book artists usually don't leave blank areas for you to imagine what might be there. There are some comic book artists that do that, but most of the time every little detail is fleshed out, because that's I guess what most people who get comics like. They want to see all that detail, all that graphics. So now I'm close to having blocked in all my big shapes, and now I'm going in within the character shape that I established in that sort of reddish color, and painting on top of that layer on a layer that is being clipped by the layer I painted earlier. A clipping mask is essentially a layer that limits where you can paint. So now that I've got all my colors blocked out and all my layers established, it becomes really easy to start to make edits, like changing some colors, adding some tone. You notice because the sky layer is behind the cloud layer, I can just paint right through and not have to worry about running into the clouds. That's the beauty of working digitally, is having these layers. And as I work on this tone, because I'm working on a clipping mask, the shading is only showing up within the clouds, because the cloud layer is essentially doing a transparency lock on my brush. And as I'm doing this, of course, I'm creating some more positive and negative shapes, and I want to make sure that those are visually consistent with the positive and negative shapes everywhere else. So every step of the way, you're always trying to critically assess anything that is a curve or is a shape or a line, and does it help draw your eye to the focal point, or does it distract? And so it's a constant balancing act, creating a composition. That's part of why I really enjoy the art form myself. And so up next here, I'm gonna apply the tone, the lighting effect to the character. And the other great thing about having everything in layers is you can quickly play, and I could turn that into a night scene if I wanted to. Adjust the contrast and the saturation of the colors, and just iterate and play with what I have, and see if I can create something else that works even better for the composition as a whole. Darkening that smoke in the back, for example, really helped draw my eye to the character's face, so I'm going to stick with that. So there's a breakdown of what all my layers look like, and essentially there's not really that many. There's a layer for color, and then there's a layer for tone, which I add over the top. And because the layer is clipped, it only paints within that shape. So with the lighting, I'm trying to convey a sort of a bottom lit scenario, kind of trying to make it look like the character and the clouds are getting most of their light from the city underneath. And I'm just painting solid black, but I've lowered the opacity of the layer by 50% so I can see the details underneath it. And now I'm moving on to the smoke in the back when doing 100% white to paint highlights. And I'm not worried too much about color, because I know later on I can select these layers, and with the hue and saturation slider and colorization feature, I can change their color on the fly. So all of these passes have their own layer. I have a highlight layer, a local value or local color layer for that smoke, and I also added a shadow layer. So 3 steps: a highlight, the color, and then the shadow, so that I could really help push the contrast behind the character's face. And it's pretty typical that I will delete something and start over. So now that I've got all my shape layers, my highlight layers, and my shadow layers, I'm gonna go in and start adding some gradations. And I try to keep these sort of effects to a minimum, because it adds this sort of airbrushy look that can sometimes really detract from the nice geometric shapes that I've got going on. So most of this is really I'm gonna keep it very subtle, but what it does is it starts to add some atmospheric effects and starts to give me some nice color and tonal variation that gradiates across shapes. Now what I'm doing is erasing some of those gradients so that I can really make some parts of the figure feel like they're brighter lit. Usually what I do with these gradients is I eventually end up lowering their opacity, or I change their color, I colorize them to make it feel like the figure is getting some atmospheric lighting from the sky. But ultimately I end up toning the opacity pretty far down, and then go over the top and and paint it. You can see how easy it is now with everything on a separate layer to make really quick changes that have a huge impact on the end result of the piece. And I may have had something in mind when I went into this, but sometimes giving yourself the option to play with what you have and try something completely different gives you a whole new idea of what you could do with the piece. Like, I didn't anticipate making that smoke a reddish color, but I found that it worked really well for this composition and helped balance those yellows and really warm colors down at the bottom. It also helps frame the focal point nicely, making that white mask stand out and pop out. But I'm also noticing there's some color balancing issues with the green in the lower right, so I added some greens to the sky in the upper left. And now what I'm doing may be considered somewhat unorthodox, but this is how I work. At this point, I just flatten everything and I give up on all my layers. I still keep them, they're in a group, just in case I need to access them for making quick selections. But I treat it like a painting at this point, because I want to be able to move back and forward from sky to smoke to character, from color to shadow to highlight to ink to the ink lines immediately. Because otherwise, if I'm having to switch between layers to make these micro refinements that I'm doing now, it would just take way too long. And so by just flattening it all and treating it like a painting from this point on, I'm able to refine it fairly quickly. It's still pretty time consuming. I mean, this stage is probably going to take an hour or two to go through the entire composition like I'm doing here and just cleaning everything up and making it look really polished so that it could potentially be blown up to the size of a poster and still hold up. And all I'm doing here is working with the default brush tool, and I'm toggling back and forward between that tool and the eyedropper tool. You can see the icon pop up every once in a while. I eyedrop a color and then I just keep brushing away. And that button, that shortcut, is the Alt key on the keyboard. That way it just toggles and you can just stay on your brush tool without having to switch tools. And when you're zoomed in this far to your composition, it's inevitable that you start to see things that bother you. And this part of the process for me is one of the most enjoyable, in the sense that it's very meditative, because I can just sort of zone out and I feel like I'm operating on automatic pilot to a certain extent. And so it's the most relaxing. It's not the most creative. It's a little tedious, but I really enjoy these final steps. I feel like all that hard work to construct the composition early on, get all the colors in place that really work, make sure that I'm not polishing something that doesn't work visually or compositionally, and I can just kind of rest assured that I'm cleaning up a drawing that is going to work once I'm done, is just really reassuring and makes this part of the process a lot less stressful. There's nothing worse than being in this phase where you're refining something, and in the process of refining having to fix big problems, like the entire placement of the head or something, or the angle is wrong, or the perspective is wrong. Getting all that stuff figured out early on really makes this part of the process that much more enjoyable. And that's really why I've created all these tools, the Armature and the Tiny Towns and the Power Posers, because I really want all the technical aspects to be solved, so that as an artist I can focus on design, I can focus on color, composition. That's really what an artist can do and a machine can't, is solve the design problem, But if I can have tools that help me construct them quickly, and I don't have to worry about perspective, foreshortening, proportion, and I can just focus on design and composition and color, those are the things I really love to spend time on, then by having those tools, I'm able to spend time on that instead of on the other. So here's, again, the final image. And I went through all that touch-up work that you were seeing me do there throughout the entire composition, so that it could potentially be blown up and still hold up. You can see how simplified the city got below, but how the colors really pop out. And so I hope that was helpful. If you've been wanting to make illustrations in a sort of comic book style, hopefully this tutorial gives you everything you need to get up and running. And if you have any questions, any technical questions, or anything that you feel I didn't cover or explain clearly, just leave the questions in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks, guys. Bye.